Well, this whole notion that, there's more to fight, that there's more appeals coming. I think the appeals are a long shot. They're always a long shot. I think this notion that, the appeals process, he has a fighter's chance in the appeals process. That's just not accurate for most appeals. Appeals processes are long shots. And so I think, the political reaction will be the political reaction. People will say, hold out hope for things. And I would certainly never rule out what the future may hold. But I think you have to understand that going into the appeals process, those tough odds.
To the conversation here to talk more about kind of the political fallout as well. And Vaughn, before kind of we move more to the bigger picture of what is coming next, I want to talk first about how the campaign is managing all of this fallout.
Right. This for Donald Trump is going to be a moment. How do you make the best politically out of what is legally not great? Especially you're looking at a potential prison sentence or home confinement or fine. There's really no way to twist this on its legal end. And that's where politically, right, they've raised $52 million, they have claimed, over the first 24 hours of the verdict here. And you have seen his Republican allies step up in his defense. The one, Larry Hogan, who's running for the U.S. Senate in Maryland, he spoke out and suggested that, right, that the people should respect the rule of law and the verdict that came out. And Chris LaCivita, who is the campaign senior advisor to Donald Trump, responded that his campaign was over. That's a Senate seat that they need picked up. But when you're looking at this for the Democrats, they've really, they've stayed silent during the course of this trial. And Joe Biden gave limited words yesterday other than calling for the rule of law to be respected as it has for 250 years in the country. Take a listen, though, because Donald Trump specifically has gone on the attack accusing Joe Biden of orchestrating this entire thing, of course, which is unfounded. There's no evidence of. Yet he is using that rhetoric to try to win over political appeal. Take a listen.
This is all done by Biden and his people.
It's reckless. It's dangerous. It's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. They found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. Now he'll be given the opportunity, as he should, to appeal that decision just like everyone else has that opportunity.
And I think when you compare the way that the Democrats approached the Donald Trump trial, right, really largely not talking about Stormy Daniels or Michael Cohen or the underlying facts of the case or the testimonies that came out, right? The White House was silent throughout it. Compare that to the way that Republicans have used Hunter Biden's own criminal proceedings, his trial beginning underway, right? And the way that they have used every little detail that comes out related to Hunter Biden as a political weapon, right? There's just two different approaches that the two sides have taken. And I guess the question is, does that stay the same over the course of the 5 months, or are there two different approaches that begin to change now that the general election is becoming very near?
Devlin, if you will, kind of draw on what Vaughn is talking about here when it comes to a political approach as we're kind of getting into the crux of campaign season, and the line in which the Biden camp specifically has to walk without playing into the narrative that it was Biden's Justice Department, right? It was Biden's doing that Donald Trump was, in fact, convicted, which is completely false, as we all well know, but could very well play into Donald Trump's narrative.
Right. So the first thing, as Vaughn said, is obviously the Manhattan District Attorney does not take instructions from Joe Biden or the Biden administration. Those are two different parts of government. That's not how American law works. Second, I think one of the things that every politician facing criminal cases deals with is there is a political way to approach criminal charges and there is a legal way to approach criminal charges. And I think what you saw in the Trump trial that just ended is that the political approach often works very badly in court because he was convicted on all counts. I assume that Trump will keep applying this political approach to what he's doing, but that risks a jail sentence. On the Biden end, to me, what was most fascinating about that statement is his son, Hunter Biden, is about to go on trial next week in Delaware. This whole, we must respect the process, we must respect the verdict. That means in some ways much more and is more consequential for President Biden, seeing that we may very well have a verdict against his son in a matter of days. So we're just in a very interesting time, both politically, legally, all of it. And it cuts in a lot of different ways.
David, I want to talk about the restrictions that are in place for former President Donald Trump and also the lead up to the sentencing on July 11th. These kind of pre-sentencing interviews that have to take place by the probations department, in which they'll interview, for instance, Donald Trump's family members. They could interview Don Jr., they could interview Ivanka, Eric Trump, Melania, people connected to the former president. I know they're not necessarily required to do so. What is required by the former president throughout that process?
Well, Yasmin, what's required depends on whether or not he wants to get sentenced to probation as opposed to go to jail. So they're not strict requirements, but they're highly persuasive for the person who's ultimately going to be deciding your fate. The first big question that gets asked in these interviews is, what's your criminal history? Former President Trump doesn't have any. He aces that part of the interview. They're going to ask, do you have any substance abuse issues or issues with alcohol that we might need to take into consideration? He claims he does not. He aces that part of the interview. Then he's going to get to questions that I think he's going to find very uncomfortable. For example, they're allowed to assess his mental health. They're allowed to determine whether or not he needs counseling and whether or not he would cooperate with participating in counseling. I think he fails that part of the examination. Then they're also going to ask how he feels about the charges that were brought against him and whether or not he accepts the jury's verdict. As you said, he doesn't have to answer, but the problem here is it's not difficult to look at statements that he's made publicly about both. And it's impossible for Judge Marchand to ignore those. It's also impossible to ignore the fact that Judge Marchand appears to be somebody who really cares about fairness. And it's almost impossible not to compare Trump with Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen was an imperfect trial witness. He's a near perfect punishment witness to compare Trump to in this regard. You've got somebody who pled guilty and he accepted his punishment. He shows remorse and he did his time. Different charges, different structure, but still, it's very difficult to look at someone who says, look, I didn't do anything wrong at all. I don't have any remorse at all, and then conclude that that person shouldn't serve any jail time at all.
David, DA Alvin Bragg, he had this press conference quickly after the conviction just across the street. And he did not indicate either way as to whether or not the prosecutors were going to ask for, or the Manhattan DA's office is going to ask for jail time. What goes into accounting for what they, in fact, ask for when it comes to sentencing?
Yasmin, they're going to think about the exact same things Judge Marchand is going to think about. And that's all what I broke down in terms of what that pre-sentencing interview is going to consist of. I think something that Bragg is also going to think about is making sure that no one can come back and say that Trump received any unfair treatment that could be used against him in terms of an appeal. And in that regard, it's very easy to look at this conviction or soon to be conviction and conclude, man, this was a slam dunk from the beginning. It was not. And the things that Bragg has done very well are easy to overlook, not the least of which is staying calm in the face of all the public attacks against the system, which he's the center of when it involves a prosecution. So I think his recommendation will be balanced so that no one can come back and claim that Trump didn't get a fair trial. And former President Trump is correct about one thing. He did receive an unfair trial. It was wildly unfair in his favor. He got away with things that people never get away with, not from the judge and not from the prosecutor. And all of that will inhibit his ability ultimately to successfully appeal this case.
I was speaking, David, to Stormy Daniels' attorney in the hour before last. This is my third hour on now. And I asked him if Stormy was actually going to attend the sentencing hearing. And he said if the prosecutors ask for her to attend, she'll likely attend because she respects them. If she were to attend the sentencing hearing, would she have any role in that hearing?
Yasmin, I don't think she'll have any role in this hearing. I think it'd be very different if we're talking about a special crime where she was actually a direct victim of the offense. Right. But something that's always important to keep in mind when you're a prosecutor is how these cases impact individuals who are at the center of the case, how they are made to feel over the course of litigation. I do think there are aspects of what Stormy had to endure that will be meaningful for her to get to sit in the courtroom and observe the sentencing. And so I'm thankful to hear they're going to let her be part of it in that respect.
So we were talking about this in the last hour, which was who is the victim here. And with Suzanne Craig, we talked about how voters would be the victim. How would you represent voters as the victim, David, in this trial during a sentencing hearing?
Here, the voters represent the general public, and our criminal justice system has been under fire for quite some time, and that's been perpetuated by Trump because what he's forcing us to realize is how unfair this system can be. And in that regard, it's very important to hold him accountable the way you would hold anyone else accountable in this circumstance. And I would look at Judge Marchand and I would say, Judge Marchand, I understand he's a former president. At the same time, we both know that anyone who's behaved the way that he has up to this point would be facing jail time in response to his conduct. Because ultimately, the question is this: is this somebody that we can work with on probation, or is this someone that we need to put behind bars? One of the considerations in that analysis is whether or not this person maintains company with disreputable people. And he does. He has a surprisingly number of people that he associates with who have either landed themselves behind bars or are currently facing charges. He's not someone who under any other circumstance would be a good candidate for probation, despite the fact that he does not have any criminal history.
Devlin, there's one thing that I keep going back to, which was Trump's gag order violation hearing with Judge Juan Merchan. And he actually said to the court on the record that he certainly did not want to have to put the former president of the United States in jail for violation of a gag order. And not just because it would slow the process of the trial down at the time, which seems like it was now 10 months ago, despite the fact that it was only a couple of weeks ago at this point, but because he is the former president of the United States and the message that would send to the general public. Do you think we can draw from that commentary from the judge as to where he will land when it comes to the sentencing?
You know, that's a great point. I really think we can draw from it. I think what Merchan said in that moment was, don't make me do it. And I think that's been Merchan's posture on a lot of these issues with Donald Trump since this trial began and even before. And I think to all the great points that have been made, I think you can sort of sum that up to say, Donald Trump's behavior running into this sentencing is incredibly important because he had what the system wants from defendants who've been convicted is some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And he doesn't want to do that.